Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Shall we get started? First of all, let me introduce myself. For those of you who don't know, I see some familiar names, which I always love to see. But my name is Eric Malice. I am the Chief Product Officer here at National Test Systems, and I'm also the co-founder. Note says over 20 years. We're really creeping up on 25 years experience in this business. Wow, been a long quarter century. When my brother and I started this company back in 2001, my brother was a great business-minded guy. He was always good at figuring out inventory and billing and all this other stuff that I had literally zero interest in learning about, which is not the way my brain works. I was always much more interested in the science side of everything. I wanted to find out how the drug tests worked. I wanted to find out how the drugs worked. I wanted to find out really everything I could about clinical toxicology, but especially as it relates to what we're doing here, which is essentially drug testing. That's our primary focus. National Test Systems, we as a company, we think education is a hugely, hugely important part of what you do. I always like to joke that we're not selling you guys paper towels. There's a little bit more technology in an instant drug test than there is in paper products. Not to take anything away from people making paper products, but there's a little more expertise, a little more technology, a little more chemistry, a little more biology, a little more science involved in what we do with drug testing than you might normally find in something like a paper product. So that's why we think education is hugely important. Listen, anyone can order cups on eBay, but you're not going to get any support. You're not going to get any education. We do this because we know how helpful it is. And by the number of you that are here today, I love it. I love to see that so many of you are interested in learning a little bit more about the way these things work, getting into my mind a little bit. And, it should make things easier for you. Let's put it that way. So we have about a 20-25 minute presentation today, after which we will do any questions that may arise. If you look on the left-hand pane of your screen, you should see some buttons. First one says people, and below that questions. If you would please put your questions in that section. I am going to wait until I'm completely done with the presentation before we start the questions, but I will get to them. If for some reason we don't get to all the questions today, just know that your consultant will reach out to you in the coming days, and they will give you an opportunity. Obviously, they'll answer any questions we might have missed. They'll give you an opportunity to request subjects for future webinars. They'll give you an opportunity to request training one-on-one with us and with your staff, either on the subject or on any other subject that might be useful to you and your staff. I always joke about this as well. When I say we've got about 25 minutes today, to me, in my head, that's a long webinar. If I'm inviting you into my house to hear me talk, I'm not going to take all of your day. You guys have work to do. I've got work to do, So I try and keep it brief. So with this subject, and we'll get into that in a second, there's a lot more to it. So if you want to invite me into your house and have a 2-hour conversation about this, I absolutely will. But I'm not going to drag 100 people into my house and make them all sit there and, not want to get up and leave because they don't want to be rude or whatever it might be. And then again, my tagline, we are trying to make your daily drug testing duties a little bit easier, or at least a little bit more insightful. Oh, and then one last thing. If for some reason you had colleagues or other staff members that were hoping to make it today and just couldn't for whatever reason, just know we post a recording of this on our website within a day or two. When you log off at the end of this, there's a little exit poll and allows you for comments. We will have access to that. So if you say, hey, send me this, we'll see that. We'll make sure it gets sent to you. So don't be afraid to put a little commentary in there as you would. So what are we talking about today? Today we are discussing the expectations of drug testing. Half of that really is the limitations of drug testing. Half of it is we know what the limits are, but we don't always share the expectations correctly with what the limitations are. So we're going to discuss the good, understanding how beneficial they can be, the bad, understanding again the limitations, And then the ugly, which is just some weird oddball stuff that you might never even thought of, that's going to give you a result that you may or may not have been expecting. And that's what a lot of this is with expectations. We're expecting to see one thing, the result's saying something different. Why is that? So this is going to give us a better understanding of that. And listen, not everyone wants to tell you about the limitations of an item that they want you to buy from them. And I get that. But I think it's more important for you to understand. I think it's more important and more helpful for what you do all day, every day. It'll make your daily drug testing duties a little bit easier, or at least a little bit more insightful. So the way I broke this down for you guys today, and this is as much for me as it is hoping that you'll understand it as well, I decided to break this down to 3 separate categories of what our expectations might be. We have qualitative, root word there, quality, yes or no. We want a positive or negative. So we're going to talk about the qualitative effects of drug testing. Next is quantitative. We're talking about quantity, typically levels or that sort of thing, levels. So that's our quantity, our quantitative. And then the last one I just kind of made up because it fit in my mind. So hopefully you guys will follow along with me on this one. And that's called speculative. And that's where a lot of us think we are expecting something for these tests to do that they may or may not. And they may, but they also may not. So we'll talk a lot about the speculative as well. Now, some of these have overlapping subjects. You'll hear me mention adulterants at least probably 3 times until you're sick of me. And some of the things like level do kind of fit into both qualitative and quantitative. All right, so let's get rolling on that. The first thing we want to talk about is qualitative. And again, especially with an instant test, we're looking at a positive or negative. You're not getting a level. You're not really getting anything that's going to give you a quantity of what this might mean. So cutoff level is the first thing there. Every drug test has a cutoff level. And a cutoff level is the minimum concentration required for that instant test to trigger a positive result, or a lab screen, any screen. Excuse me. So we're going to talk about that a lot. And we also need to understand a few different concepts before we get too deep into that. So let's talk about those. The first thing was going to be calibrator. Calibrator is also something we would call the target substance. So for example, on a benzodiazepine test, standard benzodiazepine screen, instant or lab, the target substance, the calibrating substance, is oxazepam. Now, there are other variations, but for our purposes here, again, don't want to keep you an hour and a half. For our purposes here, let's focus on the standard benzodiazepine panel. So we've got our target, we've got our calibrator drug, and that's going to come into play in the next slide. And another important principle to understand is metabolite versus parent compound. So a parent compound is a compound that's ingested by the user. So if we're talking about benzos, alprazolam is Xanax. If you take a Xanax, you're going to have alprazolam in your urine. What your body turns that alprazolam into as it is purging it from its system is called the metabolite. Now, there are many metabolites. Some are better than others for our purposes for detecting drug use. But it's still an important theory to understand that in a lot of these cases, we are detecting the metabolite because it either lasts much longer, which is great for your intestine, or it covers a bunch of different substances that metabolize into the same substance, which we're going to look at in a second, especially with the benzos. Excuse me. So those 2 principles alone should get you through this next section. And again, if you want to schedule an all-day meeting with me and really dive deep into some of these concepts and really understand what's going on with these tests, by all means, reach out to your consultant. Let's get it done. If you know me at all, I love to talk about this. And most of you are tired of me and want to shut me up already, but that's okay. Excuse me. All right, so like I said, we're going to focus on benzos because it is a very interesting category of testing. So as I mentioned, and you can see here toward the bottom, these are listed alphabetically there, we have our oxazepam, and we show our concentration at 300 nanograms per milliliter. So again, the concentration is a mass of, in this case, oxazepam within a fluid volume of urine. So we have our nanograms per milliliter. So we've got a weight inside of a measure. That's how we determine a concentration of a certain substance, whether it be a drug like benzos, whether it be, when they test your creatinine or anything else when you go for a doctor's appointment, they're usually expressed as a concentration, typically nanograms per milliliter, picograms per deciliter. There's a bunch of different ones, but for the most part, concentration is expressed as a weight or a mass within a fluid substance. All right. So we have our oxazepam here, which is our calibrator, our target substance, and that's at 300 nanograms per milliliter. Again, there's a bunch of different benzo tests, but we're going to stick with the main one, basically. Excuse me. So let's say, using our Xanax example from the last slide, which again is alprazolam, we have a concentration of 200 nanograms per milliliter. So basically, it will also detect alprazolam at 200 nanograms per milliliter. So you think, oh, that's great. It's even more sensitive than it is toward the oxazepam. But the difference is learning what calibrators are made for which benzos. With the benzos, we try to make it as broad a category as we can. You see here, there's 18 or so different benzo byproducts, metabolites, or parents listed. But there's probably 50 different benzodiazepines that actually make up that drug class. So we need to know which substances our benzodiazepine test will be sensitive to. So you think, well, alprazolam, that's great. If people take Xanax, it's a lower concentration. It should definitely pick it up. Realistically, when somebody takes Xanax, the urine's more than anything going to show the alpha hydroxyalprazolam, its primary metabolite. So again, what we do with these tests is we calibrate it to one among the substance that is going to give us the best detection. In this case, it's oxazepam, because it's a very common metabolite amongst benzos. And typically you'll get the alprazolam, you'll get the diazepam, you'll get the temazepam. So you get a lot of different benzos that you might not normally if we were to pick a more focused calibrator, a more focused target. But it's just not going to cover every single of the 40 plus different benzodiazepines that exist in the world. So that's why the specificity is important. It'll tell you, which substances are being detected at what cutoff level. And then one last minor note on here, when we set the cutoff level of an instant drug test, getting that cutoff level precisely, is a little bit tricky. So what we tend to do, what manufacturers tend to do, is err on the side of more sensitive than the side of less sensitive. In other words, most people out there doing this testing would rather have, again, that oxazepam at 300. They'd rather come up positive at 250 than come up negative at 350. So they all tend to be a little bit more sensitive. And why that's important is because while the calibrator drug is tricky, all the other parts of that drug class are even harder to set that accurate, because you got to pinpoint one to pick the one to calibrate to, and everything else kind of falls into line. And that comes into play in things like the opiate tests, where we don't see great hydrocodone detection, for example. The opiate test was designed to detect codeine and morphine. So yeah, it might detect hydrocodone, but because it's not the target, it's going to be hit or miss. And we see that here in the benzo with clonazepam and some other drug classes. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole too deeply. Again, if you have more questions, please reach out. Happy to have this conversation with you. Excuse me. And then with the qualitative, we have actual cross-reactivity. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more when I have it broken down a little better for you. But basically cross-reactivity. So if I look at our last slide again, by the way, you'll see that it notes some of these substances. Even though they're benzodiazepines, it lists them as cross-reactive. Technically, if you wanted 100% precision, it would only detect that oxazepam. That's the target. In this case, we're happy it detects all these other things, but technically it's a cross-reaction. However, when you and I discuss these things on the phone or email or whenever we talk, we think of cross-reactivity as more of a substance that has nothing to do with that drug class. And that's actually giving us a positive result that we were not expecting. Excuse me. All right, so while we're on cross-reactivity, let's talk a little bit about the most common cross-reactants. These are substances that will cause a false positive fairly consistently on any screen, even though they have nothing to do chemically or otherwise, anything to do with our target substance. So I'm going to come back to number one because that one's got a little caveat, but let's start with number two, ranitidine. So ranitidine is Zantac, an over-the-counter, it's called an H2 blocker, basically an acid reflux medication. That will cause a positive for the methamphetamine panel, very common. Number three, we've got doxylamine. Doxylamine is the sleepy part of Unisom and NyQuil, basically. That's going to pretty regularly cause a positive on the methadone panel. My northern friends see that a lot around the winter. On our oxycodone panel, we have naltrexone. Naltrexone is becoming more popular now with like Vivitrol shots for medication-assisted opiate treatments. There's a caveat there for the fentanyl, but that one's still in flux, so we'll talk about that in a second. And then lastly, on the PCP panel, we have two cross reactors. We have Effexor, and that's another, an anti-anxiety or antidepressant. And then we have Lamictal, which is, or Lamotrigine, which is the generic name for it. That will pretty regularly cause a positive, false positive on the PCP panel. Number one that I skipped is because, like I said, there is an asterisk on it. So basically, up until, let's call it 2 years ago, every fentanyl test that was ever produced could cross-react with Buspirone or Buspar. Starting November of 2023, a new generation, for lack of a better term, a new generation of fentanyl tests has come into the scene. And a lot of those would not cross-react with Buspirone, but a lot of those would cross-react with Trazodone. And then there's now a third generation of fentanyl tests which should not cross-react with either. If you don't know, reach out. We'll talk about which fentanyl test, read your insert. Let's make sure that you know which fentanyl test you have and which cross-reactivity you might expect from that test. One of those days, guys. Sorry about that. So next, let's talk about the quantitative. And again, quantitative has to do with levels and has to do with things of that nature. And this really breaks down in a few different ways. So with the quantitative, a lot of, especially street drugs, you can't measure a dosage. Now with dispensaries and where they have legal marijuana or medical or what it might be, sure, they'll tell you what percentage of THC comes in that product. But let's say two guys standing on the corner smoke a joint together. One might take a bigger inhale. One might hold it in their lungs longer than the other. So you're not getting a consistent dose, certainly not getting a measurable dose on either of those individuals. Like, you know what the concentration is inside of that product that you bought, but you don't know when it was ingested, how it was ingested, and how much drug was getting into the system. And again, it's very common with street drugs because, you buy heroin on the street these days, maybe it's fentanyl, maybe it's something else completely, maybe it's xylazine. So you're really not exactly sure what you're getting in a lot of these cases, whether it be, just a level or an actual target substance that's in there. Another thing that affects quantitative would be inconsistent metabolization. So take those two guys standing on the corner smoking a joint. Let's assume for 1 second that they could take the exact same amount of active ingredient into their bodies that same day standing on that corner. 2 days from now, when you test them, you're not going to get the same level. You're not going to get that same quantitative result in those two specimens. There's just too many variables in the human body. People are different, amount of body mass index. People metabolize quickly. People drink a lot of water. People just have, fast metabolizations. Everybody's physiology is a little bit different. So even if two people, again, these two guys, let's say they decided to take a Xanax, same dosage, and we know the dosage because it was professionally produced, we can't expect that same level a day or 2 days later between the two of them because there are so many different factors involved. And then there's my guy, concentration or dilution. Like I said, I've mentioned this a few times. The concentration or dilution of a specimen is hugely, hugely impactful of that concentration of substance that's going to be found in that specimen. So let's say, picking these same two guys, I know they had quite a weekend, one of them happened to drink a little more water that day. So we look at the two specimens and we can't say one's higher than the other unless we include the creatinine values, the pH level, whatever it might be. So that concentration dilution is really one of the biggest factors involved in determining if the result you're looking for is going to be what you expect it to be. So those of you who do have adulterant panels on your cup, please at very least take 2 seconds to read the creatinine. And what I always tell people is make a mental note, make an actual note. People's bodies are pretty consistent. So if somebody's giving you a pretty good creatinine value over and over and over again, and they come in and it's one day and it's very faint or very light, very low, it should raise a red flag, at least to some extent, and make you stop and consider what other factors might be involved in what's going on. Why is the specimen so much more dilute than usual? Were you trying to do something? Just happen to be well hydrated that day? But again, main thing is it means it's not going to be the same concentration of substance as the guy he was on the corner with. So I don't want to go too deep into adulterants because we've got multiple webinars on there. I've got a webinar on how to actually run the adulterants and how to read them. And then I have another adulterant webinar on what the results might mean and how you can handle it. But basically, again, there's two parts to what we colloquially call adulterants. There is adulterant, and then there is specimen validity. And I don't know if this is a real definition, but in my mind, adulterant indicates intent. Somebody drank a tea or bleach or whatever. Everyone's doing crazy things now. Gel. People do something with the intent of beating the drug test. And that's why you have things like a test for glutaraldehyde, nitrites, and oxidants. But then there are more common three that we test for is specific gravity, pH, and again, my favorite, creatinine. While it may not show us intent to beat a drug test or to try and mask the presence of drugs in someone's urine, it might tell us whether or not we have a valid specimen. Somebody's creatinine is very low. Doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to beat the test, but it might mean you just don't have a valid specimen. So if someone comes in, their creatinine is very low, it might behoove you to say, hey, you know what, have a seat. Let's wait a little bit and see if you can give me another specimen that has a reasonable amount of concentration to it. Excuse me. And then lastly, we're going to talk about speculative. And this isn't always, I kind of came off like this was things you guys were doing wrong, and it's not. We all have some misconceptions about some of the drug tests we use and what they can do and what they can't do. This is pretty much the gist of that right here. So the first thing I mentioned is hard targets. So for example, I pointed out the benzodiazepine panel before and showed you the specificity of it. You saw there was about 18 different substances, but I also mentioned there are 45 different benzos that comprise that benzodiazepine class of drugs. There is not a test for every benzo that's ever been created. So there are some of these that are hard targets. Obviously, you need to find the happy medium between testing everybody for 500,000 drugs and the cost and the time that would entail, and trying to think of things that that are actually occurring and being used and misused in the U.S., in your area, in your neighborhood, in your area, in your state, in your county, whatever it might be. And that's really where I have to give our consultants a lot of props when they reach out to you to see, what drugs might be most important for you to test for. They've done the research. They've checked the news. They've checked, reporting from law enforcement. They know what drugs are prevalent in your neighborhood, and they can guide you really well about what drugs are most important to test for. And again, you might not catch everything in a situation like that, but for the most part, they've got you covered. And if they stumble, they've got me to fall back on. So next thing is too many substances. Even if we had tests for everything, like I said, you can't test for 1,000 substances. I mean, there's there's probably 20 opioids that we just don't test for because it doesn't make sense. We don't test for Demerol. We don't test for Dilaudid. There's a lot of substances that we just don't test for. And again, it goes back to the hard targets. But my biggest complaint about that is something like K2, the K2, K3 spice. There are over 100 different synthetic cannabinoids that exist in the world. Our test, which is probably near the top of the wide range of substances testing for, I think we're up to like 48 or something like that. So again, it's hard to get everything because there is just so much of it. And then lastly, actually, the last thing on my slide here is a specimen type, but I want to hold off on that and talk about window of detection as well. And that'll kind of go into our next section here. So we have a window of detection. Not every drug is detected for the same amount of time, even just sticking with urine. I'll get into the different specimen types in a sec. But, we have things like cocaine, 1 to 2 days detection time. We have things like THC, which is 45 plus in some cases, but that's only chronic use. But how do you know? There's a lot of different variables involved in this window of detection that you may not know. We're learning new things about people who are chronic fentanyl users, where the metabolite, we talked about that earlier, the primary metabolite is going to be detectable for weeks after cessation. So that's a lot of new information, just because fentanyl misuse is relatively new. It's only 10 years of history at this point. So, but let's focus more on the different specimen types, because I think that can throw a lot of people as well. So with urine testing, again, in my estimation, urine testing is the best specimen for what all of us do. I'm assuming everyone here who joined us today is either here because they're in criminal justice, they're in healthcare, rehab, detox, whatever it might be. You kind of want to get a picture of whatever somebody's used in the preceding few days, few weeks, whatever it might be. That's why urine is such a good specimen type. Pretty stable. You can ship it to the lab. If it takes 2 days, it's still stable. It's fine. And it's just very common. Everyone knows P cup. You get thrown into probation, you're going to have to pee in a cup. It's just one of those things. And then we have things like oral fluids testing. So oral fluids tests, for example, really detect only things up to 24 hours after ingestion. So if we just stop there, for example, if somebody, for example, comes into you the first time and they smoked a joint in the parking lot before they came to see you, if you test them with urine, it's not going to be detected yet. It takes a few hours for the cannabinoids, the THC, to metabolize and start showing up in your urine specimen. However, the oral fluids testing, because oral fluids toxicology closely mimics blood, you'll see it right away on oral fluids testing. Conversely, sweat patch testing is going to detect anything used 1 to 3 days prior to putting the patch on, till 1 to 3 days prior to removing the patch. And then we get the hair testing, which is up to 90 days, but it doesn't start for 10 days. So you can't really expect every specimen type to give you the same answer. You don't want to use one urine test you don't want to use an oral fluids test to see if your urine test is correct, because it's not looking for the same thing. And in most cases, it wouldn't really have the same result. It could, depending on the timing, but in most cases, it wouldn't. All right, looks like we have a question so far. Let's see. Karen, are these false positives related to strips only? Would they show a false positive level of confirming them? So there's two different things that a lab can do, Karen. One is screen, and depending on the lab, a lot of labs simply screen, and if they don't find what they like, they don't bother confirming. But no, a screen, whether it be an instant test or a lab test, is based on the same technology. So I would say, as far as instant versus lab, if we stop there, probably going to run into the same thing. If we finish your sentence and say the level of confirming, then no. That's the beauty of confirmations and why they're so important, because there is no cross-reactivity on a laboratory confirmation. Just got to make sure your laboratory is actually doing confirmation. Some labs won't unless you're very, very specific about it. So I don't want to name names. And then Ronald, how do we know which fentanyl tests we have? Excellent question. So 2 ways to do it. Obviously, I always prefer when you reach out to us because I like being the guy that has the answers for you. You know, it's kind of on my job description. But if you're lazy or it's after hours and you can't find me or whatever it might be, if you pull out the product insert, every box of tests has a multi-page insert in it. And on the last couple of pages, last page or couple of pages, there's a section called analytical specificity. And that will break down, like we saw on the benzo slide earlier, it'll break down exactly which substances will react and at what cutoff value. So if there's a cross reaction from busbarone, it'll say it. If there is a cross reaction from trazodone, it will say it. And if neither, then you're good. What test shows for kava or kratom? I have not seen a kava instant test as of yet. However, kratom testing's been around for a while. We actually have both a single panel and it's made its way on one of our 16 panel cups. I think 16, maybe the 22 also. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of kratom misuse everywhere. A lot of states, municipalities, counties have moved to really crack down on its sale. They move a little bit quicker than the federal government, obviously. But yeah, we do have testing available for kratom, not for kava that I know of, but I will do a little bit digging. This comment should show up when I review after this. So if I can find any information on that, I'll certainly share it with you, Linda. Nothing else? All right. One thing I always say, the big takeaway here is reach out to us. We want to help. We want to educate. Even if it's a simple question, that in my mind, that's still education. So please feel free to reach out. And thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for giving me a half an hour of your day. Like I said, I try not to monopolize your time because I know you guys have actual jobs to do as well. So I really do appreciate your coming. And until next time, keep on testing.